Bill, thanks for coming on the show tonight.
That's all right, anytime.
The smoking section. And if Bill has been on the show, Bill Cunningham's been a longtime activist in Cambridge with the Cambridge Alliance, the Alliance for Cambridge Tenants, ACT.
Yes, but make it very clear, I'm not speaking for ACT at all tonight.
No.
I'm not on the board at this particular time. I do volunteer in the office and that's it. Anything that I say is from me and not from ACT.
I guess we got that pretty clear. You cannot.
They have to have it clear.
Okay, I think my audience is the best and the brightest, so they have got
Both
that.
of them?
They have got that.
Okay.
Very, very clearly. You don't speak officially for ACT, but Bill, you're also an active member of the Green Rainbow Party.
Well, I'm not that active with them now, and I don't speak for them either, but I am a member, and I have been active.
Well, I mean...
But let's not spend too much time on that. Let's get
Okay, let's get down to brass tacks. Bill, we worked together. We were comrades in arms, fighting the proposal to ban smoking in Cambridge housing.
Public housing, yes.
The public housing, and it wasn't the Section 8 apartments. And I think, if I do say so myself, we put up a very good fight.
We did the best we could under the existing circumstances. But I think that one battle is not the whole war. That's my feeling. So we did all right, and we got some concessions, but we shouldn't stop.
Well, what we did get, we got two concessions that were not altogether insignificant. They promised to have smoking areas outside, which they had originally not intended to allow. And they also guaranteed, at least for the time being, that residents could use electronic cigarettes, which they had not intended to allow.
Correct. Well, they hadn't even thought about it, actually. The issue arose during the discussions, and they have not banned them. Yes, that's right.
And, well, I mean, I think other housing authorities have.
But I think more important was the fact that they backed off the immediacy of the punishments that they were holding over people.
Okay, I forgot all about that.
It's very significant because in reality it means that it's a protracted thing where you get a warning, then you get another warning, and then you get a written warning, and then you have a hearing, and it's very long.
Well, thank you for reminding me about that. Now, do you have any idea what compliance are people, are people kowtowing to the authorities? Are smokers obeying the authorities, or are they kind of not so much? Do you know what that is? Do you have any idea?
I think it's probably a little of each. Where I live, which is the largest family development, Newtown Court and Washington Elms, the two developments together are the largest concentration of family, what was public housing. It's not really public housing anymore, but the smoking areas are really not paid any attention to. People do smoke outside, as they had in the past, and they don't necessarily go to the designated smoking areas, which would be difficult now to do anyway because we have so much construction going on.
Right.
And in Manning, the large elderly place in Central Square where the construction is going, they have actually posted that now people can smoke inside in the community room because the place that they were using outside, which itself was within 25 feet of the building, they had to concede that because there wasn't anything on the property that wasn't within 25 feet.
Right.
Now there's construction out there, so now people are able to smoke in the community room.
Well, that is really wonderful, and I think that looks like something we could possibly organize so that when the building is completed, perhaps we could organize a movement to get that community room still to remain a smoking area.
That will be 4 years at least before that's completed. And there can be many changes politically between now and then. It may be that the whole policy will be thrown up. Despite the trends that we see now, 4 years is a long time.
Right, so you don't think simply because the anti-smoking movement, the momentum seems to be so strong, you don't think that that necessarily means inevitability?
This is not a movement. There may have been at some point a movement, but I don't think there's a movement. What you have is what we call astroturf. You have lots and lots of people who are employed in the business of the anti-smoking campaigns. And as we saw when we were doing the public hearings around the city,
right,
when they were trying to implement this or trying to carry it out, there were so few people turning out, rank and file, turning out to champion the ban, that they brought in professionals that were.
They had to go to Harvard School of Public Health.
And from Somerville and stuff, Somerville people in public health. So it's not a movement. It's wrong to say it's a movement. I don't know what you'd call it, but there are not large numbers of people engaged in this struggle on either side. It's a struggle of professionals against a relatively small number of activists.
Resistance fighters,
yeah.
if you will. Well, but when you say there are small numbers, the number of people who are being affected by this
are very large. Yes.
Are very large.
But people, of course, as we saw, even before the Cambridge regulations were passed, there was this show on Channel 5, as you may have heard of, where they went all around Boston public housing after a year after the ban was passed there, showing people smoking the same as ever.
Which is great. Which is a great
means
thing.
that the enforcement is going to be extremely irregular in the public housing field. It's in the private housing and in the voucher buildings where you're getting real enforcement. People are being evicted.
Are they really? So here in Cambridge? Like you're talking 888 Mass Avenue?
And all over the...
No, not 888. What's the number on Memorial Drive? There's a building
That's
there.
808 Memorial Drive. I don't know what's going on there.
Right.
But I know that, I won't name the buildings, but I know of a couple of buildings where actual people have been forced out. And of course around the country, that's where it's happening. People from Springfield contacted us about a couple of years ago saying, oh, it was happening in Springfield, and on investigation it turned out they weren't public housing. They were these mixed use buildings. And incidentally, when we could move right now to talk about the fact that HUD is trying to make this a compulsory thing all over the country.
Right. Well, HUD announced this in mid-November, from what I understand. There is a public comment period until mid-January. Mm-hmm. And there was a conference on December 3rd at Harvard School of Public Health. Unfortunately, I didn't know it was happening. I would have loved to have been there. It was run by a guy named Howard Koh, who is a professor there and who was also an assistant undersecretary for Health and Human Services in the current administration. And to just kind of let you know who this man is, I was at a meeting at the Harvard School of Public Health about 10 years ago, roughly, and he said that he had considered asking the legislature in Massachusetts to demand that on every package of cigarettes in the state that was being sold, the text, "You are the scum of the earth," be printed on. So this man takes it he has an emotional investment.
He's
Howard
right
Koh.
over the edge there, yes.
And he was running this conference. He's a very highly thought of warrior. So they had this conference there. Now, what did this take you by surprise, the HUD announcement, or?
Well, I didn't exactly expect it, but it's not totally unexpected, I suppose. I think that when you see the initial efforts that HUD made to give guidance to encourage housing authorities to do this, you might expect that eventually these are pilots, and then they're going to see how it works out, and they're going to use the experience of these other housing authorities to tell them what they're going to do, make it compulsory everywhere. Ironically, the HUD directive does not apply to what's called mixed finance developments. And that's what all of Cambridge is going into. That's what what this big transformation from public housing into something called rental assistance demonstration project means in Cambridge, is that what used to be public housing now is mixed finance.
Right.
And so technically, it would not be required, HUD would not require Cambridge to do this.
Yes.
So,
well, my question then, how can we fight this? I mean, public comments, obviously, people emailing, do you think they pay any attention to them at all?
not much. Even the public comment that we make here on at the hearings, the annual hearings for the plan that have to go to HUD, they don't really read most of the things. But when we're local, and even at the state level, we have some opportunity to influence policy, which I think is largely lacking on the national level. I'm not telling people not to send in comments, but when you get to Washington, you're talking about people who are in lobbying organizations that make $600,000 a year to lobby, and who donate money to all these politicians. They're the ones that they listen to. They're the ones that they actually pay attention to. I don't know if, aside from the tobacco companies, if there's anybody in Washington that's going to make the case that they'll be listened to.
Well, just to kind of confirm what you said at this hearing, or this conference they had at Harvard, these are the kinds of people who were there. They weren't there to discuss whether the proposal was good or bad. They were there to see how well they can make the proposal work, how quickly they can get it running, how quickly they can get enforcement and so forth. And the kinds of people who were there, federal officials, representatives from major non-governmental organizations, tobacco cessation experts, experts in public health and public housing, gathered at Harvard to discuss how best to help implement, evaluate, and enforce. So they're not, it's not exactly what you would call a very democratic.
No, and of course this is a conference and not in Washington where the regulations are actually being written.
Yes.
So I noticed that among the questions that HUD says they like input on is whether hookahs should be exempted.
Really?
And whether electronic cigarettes should be exempted.
Yes.
Otherwise, they didn't suggest anything else. The HUD proposal actually, the meat of it, over half of it is actually text, the usual stuff explaining why secondhand smoking is deadly and that there's no safe amount to be tolerated. Although when it comes to radioactivity, of course, they do say there are safe amounts of radioactivity and there's safe amounts of Agent Orange and all that.
And there are safe amounts of cooking fumes and gas fumes and dust and rodent excreta and pesticides.
And political bullshit.
Those they're all safe limits.
But this one is absolutely one molecule. You can't tolerate it. The odd thing also about the HUD proposal is that it explains that if only people are not allowed to smoke in their homes, that the residents will be 100% protected from the so-called secondhand smoke, and even in infinitesimal amounts. And the truth is that the survey that they were starting to do 2 years ago, comparing Boston, which was supposedly enforced.
Oh, right, I remember that. Okay. Yes.
They couldn't really carry it out because they found that these infinitesimal amounts, of course, drifted in from the street. And even from miles away. So that's not true. Their premises, even if their premises were correct, the policy that they propose is not going to do what the premise required.
But it is a step towards the total prohibition of tobacco in the United States.
That won't happen.
You don't think so?
People
Well,
with money, in their big homes, will be able to do anything they want.
well, the thing is, okay, well, I've had this argument with people before. Perhaps not. We don't know, but definitely, all of these groups, these grant-funded groups and non-governmental organizations and public health authorities and people very, very high up in the government do want to see a total prohibition of tobacco, and they are working very hard at that, and there's a lot of money being spent on that. Now, you know, so you don't think that they're aiming for that. Now, whether or not it will come to pass, I certainly hope it doesn't come to pass.
The zealots will always aim for purity, but the power system will make sure that ordinary people are the ones that are controlled and not the people who do the controlling. They will do anything they want behind their own closed doors.
Well, if 99% of the population is forbidden to smoke in one way or another, either by high taxes or by the fact they can't smoke in parks or they can't smoke in their own homes or in bars, that will be close enough to total prohibition.
Remember the famous quote of Anatole France, I believe it was.
Oh yes, certainly.
You know, people, the wealthy and the poor are equally forbidden to sleep under bridges.
Right, well, because the law is very equitable.
People in their private clubs,
well, I mean,
ones that we don't even hear about.
Well, that's not perfectly true, Bill. I think here's a factual. I hesitate, and I'm sorry to, but I mean, for example, in New York City, all private clubs are forbidden to allow smoking, no matter how rich or how exclusive they are.
Depends on how private they are.
Well, I mean, I don't know. That we don't know if they exist or not. Yes, I suppose there are probably some private clubs in New York that we don't know that exist. And then again, for example, a lot of the very exclusive high-end hotels and high-end apartment buildings or condominium buildings
That's right.
are banning smoking.
That's
So
right.
now, I don't know, I mean, I suppose if you're so rich and you can build an entire building in New York, but even then you would still be, you'd be in violation of the laws. Now,
But it's not going to be enforced because the truth is, we know
Right.
that you can actually seal, you can build things so that you don't smell smoke from one place to the other. I've lived in my doorway,
Right.
which has 9 apartments, for 14 years now. And I have never smelled a trace of any kind of smoke or even cooking from any other apartment. Because in fact, the woman who was in charge of all this when they were pushing the ban through admitted that there were a few places that actually were like that, even though she denied it was possible. And my place, Newtown Court, is one of them.
Because it's built well.
You cannot detect any smells coming from any other apartment in my doorway.
Well, I was going to ask you because you're of course a lot older than I am.
Well, I'm older than everybody. I don't know about a lot.
My question to you then is, have you ever seen anything in your life that is anywhere as pervasive as the anti-smoking campaign? I mean, that affects people so intimately in their daily lives, you know, in bars, in parks, in their own homes. I mean, have you ever seen anything like that in the United States?
As we said earlier, I really can't think of anything. On the other hand, on the bright side, the pervasiveness so far is more in the intent, since I see people smoking, and I'm sure I could smoke in my apartment and nobody would know the difference. And if nobody complains, nobody's going to come after me. So the pervasiveness of it is spotty. If you have a manager, I think of a couple now, who are particularly intrusive, then it's really a terror instrument in that development.
Right.
But if you have managers who are simply, oh, here's another thing I have to do, I have to take people's boots out of the hallway. They're not allowed to keep their boots outside their door. I have to remove, they just don't do it, right? They go.
Yes, well, I'm glad to hear that, and I hope that is pervasive all over the country.
That's the people's resistance to bureaucracy, and even in the Soviet Union.
Bureaucratic bullies.
Everywhere the bureaucracy tries to penetrate, they have only so many things that they can do. The bureaucrats can only do so much. But the trouble is that it becomes arbitrary. Then the terror is the arbitrariness of it. That you have all these rules. You have this rule like this. You never know when it's going to be enforced on you, or whether the manager lets you go now, but maybe he won't let you go if you do something else.
Right, and it also has a tendency that even if he's letting you go, you definitely don't want to raise your voice about an issue if you live in public housing, because you know
That's right.
you could be extorted.
On a somewhat different note, so you have a meeting going on in public housing, and you have these people saying, I see these kids smoking dope out there, blah, 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 we've got to put a stop to this. And I know the person who's speaking smokes dope in her own apartment,
Right.
and then half the people in the room do it. But in public, they get this thing going, and this is going to be the same thing with smoking. Now that it's passed, the resistance that we had before turns the other way, and people say, I saw so-and-so, I know so-and-so smoking in her apartment. I saw Mr. So-and-so sitting out on the bench smoking. He's not supposed to be doing that. He's supposed to be over.
Now, why do you think that is the case? I mean, why do people have that?
It's human nature.
What is human nature? To kind of bother other people and want to control
To side
other
with the
people?
winners, and to use that to pounce on other people. And then it doesn't have to be everybody. It's a minority that does it. But that changes the atmosphere, so to speak, much more than secondhand smoke.
But yes, well, it's certainly, I mean, I think the pathology, I mean, for example, at this conference, somebody named Bob Bollinger of the National Cancer Institute said the whole business of public health is to change social norms and change people's expectations, which sounds kind of very much Soviet-like to me.
Well, it's not. It's hardly unique to the Soviet. It's the modern manipulation of technocrats and experts, which the Soviet Union ended up embodying quite a bit. But you have them everywhere. People who manipulate you for your own good. They think they know better than you do, so they're going to manipulate you. That's like the surveys that they did, right? On the one hand, they told us when they were trying to convince us to get rid of smoking in public housing, that this is a scientific thing, a scientific fact, that one molecule of this stuff is an intrusion on everybody else's health, and so you can't do it. On the other hand, they had a survey that purported to show that the majority were in favor of it, and the survey, of course, was manipulative.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So I wonder if they're still going to do this now that they're going to make it mandatory for the whole country. Will they still go through the charade of pretending that they're doing a survey and consulting people democratically? Because this is another part of the manipulation of public opinion.
But what can we do as a small resistance group, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights? We can email people, we can give them a sample email to send to HUD. What can we do?
Well, of course, you're not in what was formerly public housing, but wherever you are, you have to continue to speak up in meetings where people tend to side with the winner and try to be the oppressor instead of the oppressed, and speak up and don't be afraid, and say I'm a smoker,
Right.
and I smoke for pleasure, not because I have to medicate myself, and I don't believe that this is a right I should have. And I know.
You do believe it's a right I should have?
Of course.
Okay, yes.
Of course. I mean, I know I have friends who say, well, if you accept, I accept that there's a health risk. I think that anybody who, especially the kind of tobacco products that are full of additives that they put out, that there's some danger to smoking yourself. The secondhand smoking becomes a really flaky issue. But I know, if you're gonna smoke 3 packs a day, you're probably gonna endanger yourself. That's what I believe. But, so then somebody says, well, if you get sick, then somebody else has to pay for it.
Yes.
That's the slippery slope you have to watch out for, that you're not allowed to do things that might cost somebody else
Well,
something.
as if non-smokers don't get sick.
That's right, but they get sick because you're smoking in their
Right,
face.
right. But I mean, everybody gets sick, everybody ends up costing somebody money,
Yes.
and if you're a smoker and you get sick, God forbid, and you die young, you end up costing people a lot less money than
That's
non-smokers
true.
who live to be
It's right.
95.
Right. And I
Bill,
have help.
I
have
gotta
my
cut us
help.
off. I gotta cut you off. Thanks for watching, Bill. Thanks for the encouragement.
Really, this soon?